You're entering Corsi Nation.
Okay, our guest today is Dr. Juliette Engel, MD. And Dr. Engel has got a couple of really important stories. We're going to start by focusing on the assassination of John Kennedy and what knowledge she has that adds to the book I've written, which is the final analysis. And here you can see with David Mantik. David Mantik has done the X-ray examination of the Kennedy skull X-rays from the autopsy. There's 3 of them in the archives, and he's seen them more than anyone else. He's a radiation oncologist with a PhD in physics, and he has shown that the 3 X-rays are all forged to mask evidence of frontal shots, and there were 2 shots to the front that hit Jack Kennedy. One was in the temporal bone by the right ear that blew out the occipital bone in the back of Jack Kennedy's head. Another was a bullet hit him in the forehead above the right eye at the hairline and left a bullet trail that you can see going across the top of the skull, with the largest fragment in the back and the shots not exiting the skull, which is clear evidence of a frontal shot. This is forensic evidence. It's no longer speculation. It's clear proof, and I think indisputable proof that Jack Kennedy was shot twice from the front. Now, Dr. Engel has a personal experience we're going to go through and relate, but the surgeon, when Jack Kennedy got shot, November 22nd, 1963, the Secret Service immediately brought the limousine to Parkland Hospital, which was on the Stemmons Freeway on the route that Kennedy was going to go to speak at the Dallas Trade Mart. Of course, he never got there. He was shot and killed. At the Parkland Hospital, they brought Jack Kennedy in, mortally wounded, to Trauma Room 1. And the surgeons at Parkland Hospital, still in the Trauma Room 1, the emergency room, did their best to try to save Jack Kennedy's life. They pretty well knew it was hopeless when they took a look and saw the severity of the wounds. We'll discuss that. But nevertheless, as physicians, they had a responsibility, especially with the President of the United States. They did not want it to be thought that they didn't do everything possible to try to save the president's life. So the very first things that happened was Dr. Malcolm Perry, one of the surgeons at Parkland, got to the Trauma Room 1, among the first physicians to arrive, and he saw a puncture wound to Jack Kennedy's throat, which came in through the windshield in the front of the limousine. It was a frontal shot, and it had like a small pencil mark puncture hole going into the throat. So Dr. Malcolm Perry began a tracheotomy, which is a way to get ventilation into the lungs to try to get the person breathing. That's Dr. Malcolm Perry. And that's normal procedure, normal operating room, emergency room procedure. And it was completely the right thing to do. And Dr. Engel had subsequent experience with Dr. Perry. And Dr. Engel, why don't you pick it up from there and tell us how you came to be associated with Dr. Perry?
Sure. In 1974, I was 25 years old, starting my internship at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I started on the ER rotation. That was my first rotation. And that was the week that the Parkland surgeons, so the entire, first I should say that when Kennedy was taken to Parkland Hospital, the Parkland surgical team was the #1 trauma team in the world. I mean, these were the best of the best. And they're the ones that came immediately to the ER and tried to resuscitate Kennedy until they were pushed out by people that they didn't even know who they were. But the pressure on that surgical team, and particularly on Dr. Malcolm Perry, who initially reported that he did the trach through a bullet hole, was so great that the entire surgical department had to leave Texas. I mean, this is like 15 top trauma surgeons left, moved their families, moved everything, and came to the University of Washington. So the day that they arrived, I was the surgical intern in the University Hospital emergency room. And I met Dr. Perry, and I was so stunned at meeting him. He was such a giant in my world that I dropped a glass of Diet Coke right on his shoes. Which
I'm sure.
He
I'm sure
never
that
forgot that. He was very nice about it, but I've died of guilt ever since.
I'm sure it endeared you to him. I mean,
So, hi, I'm your surgical assistant. I can't even hold on to a glass of Coke. But it wasn't long before I had my first huge trauma case in the middle of the night.
Let's break for a second and fill in some more backstory here, so everybody can follow this and know the significance of what you're going to testify to. You grew up. Where did you grew up? A lot of different places, and you have another story that we're going to get to. But when did you begin your medical studies, and where did you begin them?
After I left, I grew up in an MK Ultra program, and after I escaped and left that, I went to the University of Washington, where I worked my way through university and then got into the University of Washington Medical School. So I went to medical school there in Seattle, did an internship there, and my first internship rotation was University Hospital when the surgeons arrived from Parkland.
And what year was that?
1974.
1974. Okay. Now, the MK Ultra story that you experienced and escaped from is another really important part of your story. Now, we may not cover that entirely in this broadcast, but we will cover it much more thoroughly in a second one. And you have written a book, which is called Sparky, Surviving Sex Magic. And I'm going to recommend that everybody get this book. I think it's a compelling read, and we will cover it in detail in a subsequent podcast. If we just touch on it here, it'll just be brief because we want to cover extensively the JFK story. So Dr. Engel's got two stories that are important to us.
Probably more than that.
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean,
there's Russia.
Well, there's Russia too. We'll have to get, that's your second book, is Russia. That's I'll have to read that one next, and then we'll probably do more interviewing. But you've had a very interesting life. And your third book on Moscow traffic, your second book, Angels Over Moscow. Is that your second or third book?
Second book is Angels Over Moscow.
And Moscow traffic. Briefly, what was that experience all about?
Well, as I finished my training at the University of Washington in radiology, practiced for close to 20 years in Seattle, and then was invited to go to Russia to help reform maternal and infant health care, discovered the high number of children being abandoned and trafficked into rings where they were taken abroad and used for sex and prostitution. Did a lot of work to change that, created an underground railroad that ran for 15 years, rescuing kids from 120 different countries, and called the Angel Coalition. So the Angels are the Angel Coalition, and that describes my work in Russia.
Okay, we will cover that one as well very thoroughly. Now, let's set up the story here. So Jack Kennedy is shot, and he's brought to Parkland Hospital. And again, he's in trauma room 1. The doctors are rushing in here, and as Dr. Engel said, that this is not a slouch emergency room. These guys are top emergency room doctors. Now, why? Well, this is 1963. And Dallas is still pretty much the Wild West. I mean, it's not entirely the Wild West as it was in the 1800s, but there's a lot of people shot by gunshot, a lot of accidents, traffic accidents. I mean, everything you can imagine. But I would say the shot by gunshot wounds are probably at a statistical high at that time for Dallas. So these were physicians that were used to seeing people in fights getting gunshot. And it was not exceptional for them to know how to deal with gunshot wounds, which also meant they had to learn pretty quickly to recognize what was an entrance wound, what was an exit wound. And Dr. Engel, you have the emergency room experience. You must have done the same. And so when you're in the emergency room and you've got a patient, what's the first things you're thinking about?
Well, you think about, are they breathing? Can they breathe? Are they bleeding? Are they injured? Well, it's mostly breathing and bleeding at the first go. So I'm sure that when Dr. Perry, well, for one thing, it's not one doctor that comes in. When the surgical trauma team comes in, there's probably 8 doctors. Each of them goes to their particular area, and Dr. Perry was the premier tracheotomy surgeon in the world. I mean, he taught everyone else how to do it, including me. And so he would go right to the throat, see that Kennedy wasn't breathing, and he would go right for the trach. And so there was a lot of confusion, but a lot of people, and there was no, it takes, first you stabilize the patient. You make sure they're breathing and they're not bleeding out. So you get a line in, you do a trach if you need, and you get oxygen out.
You got to make sure they're staying alive.
Well, that's how you do it.
Yeah. And the second thing you got to figure out, I would think, is how badly is this person injured? What's the problem?
Well, once you've got them stabilized, then you start the process. All this happens very fast. I mean, this is less than a minute before you've got a line in, a trach in, and they're on a ventilator if they need to be.
Because the person could die in 20 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know if you've got to do everything you can immediately to stabilize the person, make sure they're breathing and they're not bleeding out.
So as I recall, they had people putting lines in his legs, lines in his arms, subclavian lines. So he was being worked on by multiple people.
He's being worked on by multiple people at once.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And also one of the other important players in this is Nurse Audrey Bell. Now she comes into the trauma room 1 as Kennedy's begun to be worked on. And what she is finding is that she's the nurse responsible for setting up an operating room. Now, should they be successful in saving this person's life in the trauma room, and there's significant injuries that have to be dealt with immediately, the next place that patient's going is to the operating room because it may be life-threatening to operate. So, for instance, if you had a gunshot wound and the person survives the gunshot wound, but now you got a bullet that's penetrated vital organs or is close to the heart or could be life-threatening, the first thing you want to do is get in there and try to get the bullets out, try to do the damage. Was that correct, Dr. Engel?
Yes, right. First thing you do is stabilize the patient. Get them on oxygen and get their blood volume stabilized.
Yeah, and then get them to figure out if you've got them stabilized enough to go in the operating room. Do they need to be operated on?
And what needs to be operated on? And they didn't have CT, MRI at that time. So everything was done with fluoroscopy. So it was not as efficient.
In other words, they're not doing any MRI. They're not getting a precise reading of what's inside the person.
No, they didn't have ultrasound either. That didn't come along.
There was no ability to really know what's going on inside the patient except for intuition. Now, when Nurse Bell comes in, her first thing is, okay, what do I have to do? So her testimony was, when I took a first look, I could recognize the president, but I didn't see an injury because there was no injury around his face, she explained. So I asked, where's the injury? And Dr. Perry, who was doing the tracheotomy, was standing there. He simply reached up on the president's head and he pulled it up and turned it to the left a little bit. And she said there was a gaping hole. That's where the brains and fluids were dripping out. The wound in the back of JFK's head could have been 3 or 4 inches in diameter. That's what I saw. Okay, now when you see a wound like that, first thing you know is that that's an exit wound. It's a massive avulsive, what they call an avulsive exit wound, which means that the blown out back of the head is from a frontal shot. Mm-hmm. Second is, this person's not going to survive. You're not going to replace that much brain damage, and it's a matter of time until they die. If you can stabilize them and even keep them alive for any period of time, they're probably going to be a vegetable. And with that much of the back of the head gone, blown away, Nurse Bell is not in a rush to go get the operating room prepared. She probably went and did it, but it was not like she knew it was going to be a need for an operation. Now, some of the other testimony, Dr. McClelland, who was there, another one of the top surgeons, part of the trauma team, gave his testimony. He said, as I took a position at the head of the table, this trauma room 1 is not very big. It's very tight space, and they're all crowded in here. So he took his at the head of the table, To help out with the tracheotomy, I was in such a position that I could very closely examine the head wound. And I noticed that the right posterior of the skull, and I'll show you where that is. Right posterior is the back, the occipital range. Okay, notice the right posterior had been extremely blasted. It had been shattered, apparently, by the force of the shot. So that the parietal bone, that's the bone at the top of your head, was protruded up through the scalp and seemed to be fractured almost along its right posterior half. In other words, the fractures were all on the right side of the head, and they're noticing that right away, as well as some of the occipital bone being fractured in its lateral half. So again, they're seeing that the trauma is to the right side of the head. These fatal shots are coming from the right side of the head, which again largely is going to associate with the grassy knoll in front of Kennedy. But the point is that they're not thinking about that at that moment. So I said it, and what this did, it sprung open the bones, these fractures of the occipital bone, in such a way you could actually look down into the skull cavity itself and see that a third, or at least, of the brain tissue, the posterior cerebral tissue, the cerebral tissue is just the tissue on top of the head, and some of the cerebellar tissue. Cerebellum is an organ at the back of the head, a different color, and you can recognize it easily when you're looking at the brain, had been blasted out. There was a huge amount of bleeding, which was occurring mainly from the large venous channels in the skull, which had been blasted open. Those are blood vessels in the skull, which have been blasted open. Now, a third doctor, Dr. Crenshaw, gave maybe the best description of the wound. And remember, these are recollections from the first seconds. These doctors are immediately saying, what am I dealing with here? You got to assess it quickly. So he said, I walked to the president's head to get a closer look. His entire right cerebral hemisphere appeared to be gone. It looked like a crater, an empty crater. All I could see there was mangled, bloody tissue. From the damage I saw there was no doubt in my mind that the bullet had entered his head through the front. And as it surgically passed through the cranium, the missile obliterated part of the temporal, up here by the ear, and all of the parietal and occipital lobes before it lacerated the cerebellum at the back of the head. The wound resembled a deep furrow in a freshly plowed field. Several years later, when I viewed slow motion films of the bullet striking the president, the physics of the head being thrown back provided final and complete confirmation of a frontal entry by a bullet to the cranium. Now, Dr. Engel, that's pretty clear evidence that the shot that killed Kennedy, the shot from the temporal bone through the back of the head, was a frontal shot, and it did massive damage to the head on the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, they weren't noticing any real damage to. But the doctors must have concluded, just looking at this, that this guy isn't going to make it. I mean, it would be obvious too. When you saw that kind of damage on a patient, what would be your first thought?
I don't think anybody but the president would have gotten that much resuscitation.
That it stopped.
Yeah, it would have stopped before it started. But this was the president.
And so therefore, because it was the president, you couldn't be accused of not having done everything you could possibly do. That right?
That and your adrenaline's high and you're going in there to save him. And of course you would do everything.
Well, the doctors actually got to the point where they were trying to massage Kennedy's heart to try to get him to have a heartbeat. And one of the doctors finally said, stop it. You know, his brains are all on they're blown out. The back of his cerebellum is dangling from the back of his head. The massive damage here, he's not going to survive. So therefore, we're wasting our time here. Our job is done.
So who declared him dead? I mean, that they had to have someone sort of at the top of the chain to declare him dead.
I do write about that. Let me find if I can find the passage. Finally, one of the doctors did declare that this is done and we're calling this to an end. And let me find if I can see quickly in the book who that doctor was, but there was a particular doctor who was in charge of that decision and made it.
Because in an ER situation, the intern can declare someone dead. But in
Right.
that situation,
It would take someone much more senior to actually be willing to do it.
that's right.
And okay, these are all discussions here. I'm just looking through the book, and I'll find this in a minute here. It just takes a little bit of time to. The discussion in the book was so detailed that sometimes I myself forget where I put things, but I'll find it here hopefully in a minute. Okay, now let's just do a couple more things before we get to that. Now, hopefully, I'll come across it as I'm paging through the book and get back to that point. But the doctors, when they do declare that Jack Kennedy is dead, and there's nothing more that can be done to save him. Oh, by the way, they brought in a defibrillator. They were doing everything they could. They're bringing in all the equipment they could figure out to try to do something here. They were in panic mode, and they were trying to massively save his life. So Kennedy was logged into Parkland as patient number 24740 at 12:38 Central Standard Time. And Kemp Clark was the one who pronounced JFK dead at 1 p.m. And Clark wrote, "When I saw the severity of the head wound, I thought everything we had done for him those 20 minutes was a complete waste of time. It was a 4+ injury, which no one survives." And Clark said, "My God, the whole right side of his head is shot off. We've got nothing to work with." So essentially, you see Kennedy with this horrendous wound, and there's a couple of other statements here that are interesting in that regard. Crenshaw defended the position. He said, Dr. Crenshaw said, "Usually trauma victims are stripped of all clothing so that an injury will not be overlooked. No one attempted to remove the president's briefs. I think it was out of respect for the man, the dignity of the position he held, the principles for which he stood, that we subconsciously did not want to see him lying there naked. In addition, with the horrendous head wound he'd suffered, we weren't concerned with the lower part of his body. We could have stabilized him. There would have been plenty of time to look for additional injuries." Now, why this is of substance is because when the doctors declared it was done, the trauma doctors were finished with their job. And they are now going to leave the trauma room because there's nothing further for them to do. Now others take over. Okay, the nurses take over. They've got a body. They're going to have to deal with the body. But even more importantly, what happens next is that the pathologist at Parkland Hospital, Dr. Earl Rose, shows up with the justice of the peace. And he says this was a local murder. There's no federal crime to kill the president. And so therefore, we're doing the autopsy. Now, in his book, Conspiracy, 1980, Anthony Summers wrote, "At the hospital, as the Secret Service team prepared to take the body to Washington, Dr. Earl Rose, the Dallas County medical examiner, backed by a justice of the peace, barred their way. They wouldn't let the Secret Service take the body out of the trauma room. The doctor said that under Texas law, the body of a murder victim may not be removed until an autopsy had been performed. And the justice of the peace, Judge Ward, declared, it's just another homicide as far as I'm concerned." Okay, but the Summers, in his report on Conspiracy, 1980 book, quite good book, said the Secret Service agents put the doctor and the judge up against the wall at gunpoint and swept out of the hospital with the president's body. They were wrong in laws. With the hindsight, they denied their president an efficient autopsy. So Secret Service, which, by the way, knew Kennedy was shot from the front, because Secret Service, Clint Hill, who was, when the shooting started, was on the follow-up Secret Service car. He got off the running board. He ran up, managed to get a hold on the left handrail at the back of the limousine, and he climbed onto the footboard there and got onto the car. And when Jack Kennedy was shot from the grassy knoll with the shot that hit at the temporal bone. And we can see this in the x-rays. There's a keyhole fracture. So you get an oblique wound to the side of the head, and it causes a keyhole fracture. It's not a puncture mark because it's entering at the side, and it enters with a round hole, but it's breaking about the bones in front of it. Looks like a keyhole. And that's a sign of an oblique shot, which does massive damage and cause the blowout. So that had to have been a high-powered shot that hit Kennedy, and it came from the front. And Clint Hill got splattered on the left of the limousine with Jack Kennedy's brain matter, and the inboard motorcycle officer also got splattered with the bone matter. A piece of Jack Kennedy's occipital bone flew off onto the grass to the left of the limousine. It's called the Harper fragment. It was subsequently found by a medical student like the next day and identified at the time as occipital bone, part of the back of the head that had been blown off. Now, because the trauma team did not examine Kennedy's body. Okay, so Dr. Engel, once the patient's pronounced dead, is there any reason for the doctors in the trauma room to examine the body and see what additional wounds there were?
They might.
But
they don't necessarily. If the pathologist is there to take the body, the pathologist will do it.
Right. I mean, see, your job is done in the emergency room. You didn't save his life. So why are you going to look for anything else? Pathologist is going to do an autopsy. They'll do a far better job than you did. I mean, that certainly would be a logical assumption for a surgeon in the trauma room, wouldn't it? Is that correct?
Yeah, plus there's 30 people crowded in that little room, all kinds of equipment, Secret Service. I think they probably pushed the surgeons out of there.
So the problem was that since they took the body, Malcolm Perry and Kemp Clark, who did the press conference, did not know that there was a wound in the back because they didn't turn Jack Kennedy over. There was a puncture wound in the back. So they missed that. And that becomes important in the story. Now, Perry comes out with Dr. Clark Kemp at 3:16 p.m. Central Standard Time, over 2 hours after Jack Kennedy died. And Dr. Clark and Perry were the only two Parkland physicians at the press conference. They made it clear they observed only 2 wounds in the emergency room: a bullet hole puncture wound at the midline of the throat, just below the Adam's apple, and a large gaping wound to the back of JFK's head. 3 different times, Dr. Perry affirmed that the throat wound was a frontal entrance wound. 2 times, Dr. Perry described the throat wound as an entrance wound. He said, Dr. Perry, the neck wound, as visible in the patient, revealed a bullet hole almost in the midline. Question, what was that? Perry, a bullet hole in the midline. Would you demonstrate? Perry said, in the lower portion of the neck in front, so he's pointing to the position he talked about in the midline below the Adam's apple. He said, approximately here. Below the Adam's apple? Yes, below the Adam's apple. Doctor, is it the assumption that it went through the head? That would be conjecture on my part. There are 2 wounds, Dr. Clark noted, one in the neck and one in the head. Now, whether they are directly related to 2 bullets, I can't say. So one possibility would be a bullet entered the throat, and that was the bullet that blew out the back of his head. Those are the only 2 wounds they saw. They really did not pay attention to an entrance wound to the temporal bone, because Jack Kennedy had also been hit in the back of the head, which caused a massive blowout in the front part of his head, but between the temporal bone and the parietal bone. But it didn't conflict with the very top quadrant of his head, where the bullet that went in the midline stayed in place. Now, likely that was a liquid mercury bullet, because the brain was also stained. And as in the entire story, as it evolves, we find out that the backstory, when they announced that Lee Harvey Oswald is the lone gun assassin, well, Ike Alchins, a photographer for the Associated Press, had been standing in front of the limousine when the shot occurred. He took a picture of Kennedy reacting to the bullet hitting his neck through the windshield. The Texas School Book Depository was obviously in the background. So now all the shots had to come from the back, but the body shows frontal wounds. They got a body, they're flying back to Washington, where the evidence of the body contradicts the lying cover story set up to frame Oswald. They've also got another problem. Only 3 cartridges were dropped in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and would have been set up to look like a sniper's nest. But yet, one of the bystanders, James Tay, got nicked in the cheek with a bullet. And so that meant 1 shot missed. So now 2 shots had to have done all the damage to Kennedy's head and all the damage to Connally, who it broke his ribs on his left side. It entered his wrist and broke the large bone in his wrist and ended up in his left knee. All this damage has now got to be from 2 bullets. So you got to have one that somehow struck Kennedy in the head, that did all this damage to the head. You got to have one that in the back, maybe that came out through the throat, and then it pivoted and hit Connally. That becomes the magic bullet. Okay, but to make that happen, they secretly get the body to Parkland from Andrews Air Force Base, when the plane lands at approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, Washington time. 6:30, the body's being delivered to the Bethesda morgue in a gray shipping casket and a body bag, which is not how it left Parkland. The doctors do pre-autopsy surgery to alter the wounds. And we demonstrate that. They try to remove as much of the wound, but they couldn't remove the shot at the top of the head. So I think the brain was stained, and I think the x-rays showed stained brain as well as possibly some fragments of a liquid mercury bullet that remained. So let's go back to Parkland now in the press conference. Perry says, it'd be conjecture on my part. There's 2 wounds, one of the neck and one of the head. Whether they're related to 2 bullets, I can't say. Was that an entrance wound? Perry says, there was an entrance wound in the neck. As regards to the head, I cannot say. Which way was the bullet coming from the entrance wound at him? It appeared to be coming at him. So a third time, doctor, describe the entrance wound. Do you think from the front of the throat? He said, yes, the wound appeared to be an entrance wound in the front of the throat. Okay, so Clark could not say, Clark said the head wound could have either been the exit wound from the neck or it could have been a tangent wound. It was simply a large gaping loss of tissue. Speculated the gaping posterior wound could have resulted from a bullet that entered the throat or from a separate bullet through the right side of the head. In either case, he clearly implied that the gaping wound at the right of Jack Kennedy's head was an exit wound. And he emphasized that he could not comment on JFK's throat wound because he was busy with the head wound. Okay, so we go forward a little bit further now. And what we find is that Dr. Perry gets besieged through the night by questions from Bethesda, who's doing the autopsy. And they're not satisfied that Dr. Perry said that he was shot from the front. They've got a big problem. They got to get the Parkland team to change their story. So when Saturday morning, November 23rd, 1963, when Perry showed up at Parkland Hospital for his shift that morning, Audrey Bell noticed that he looked terrible. He looked like he hadn't slept that night. And so she said, "What's the matter?" And Malcolm Perry said, "People from Bethesda have been bothering him on the phone all night, trying to get him to change his professional opinion about having seen an entry wound in the front of Kennedy's neck to one of having seen an exit wound instead." So Douglas Horne, who did the 5 volumes on the Assassination Records Review Board, said, "I don't know what Dr. Perry told his tormentors in the night of November 22nd, 23rd, 1963, but I do know he straddled the fence nicely during his March 1964 testimony before the Warren Commission, testifying to Arlen Specter that the wound in the front of the neck could have been either an entrance wound or an exit wound. By then, Perry was already compromising with the truth as he expressed it on the first day Kennedy died, when he stated unequivocally 3 times to the Parkland press, while standing next to Dr. Clark, that the bullet that pierced Kennedy's neck was coming from the front. And Nurse Bell says, there it was on the record with a government agency, apparent attempts by the members of the U.S. government the night of the autopsy, change history by altering the recollections and testimony of a key assassination witness, namely Dr. Malcolm Perry. Okay, Dr. Engel, here's again where you come into the story. Now, Dr. Perry taught you how to do your first tracheotomy. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
What happened?
Well, I was on duty in the university emergency room, university hospital emergency room, and a major trauma came in. I believe it was a motorcycle accident with the helmet stuck on the head, obvious tracheal fracture. Person was alive, but not breathing. And they called the surgeon, but the regular surgeon wasn't there, but Malcolm Perry was there. So he came into the emergency room, and I wanted him to do the trach. And he said, no, you're going to do it. And so he talked me through it. And then he kept talking. So while I'm sewing up and doing everything else I needed to do, the patient did survive after we trached him. He told me about coming in and seeing the wound on Kennedy and not even giving it a thought, that you, if there's a hole there, use it. And so that was his lesson. And he talked about what it was like that night, how crazy it was, and the importance of, because he was teaching me as a physician, you don't get distracted by the craziness all around you or any other part of the patient. You do your part, because each part is critical in a trauma team. Each one had their role to play, and if it's getting in lines or it's starting a blood transfusion, or all of those things are all part of the trauma team. And his was to do the trach. And he said he went right through the bullet hole. And I have no doubt at all that he went right through the bullet hole.
Now, Dr. Perry, you were Dr. Engel, you were in other operations with Dr. Perry where he was doing the surgery.
Yes, as his intern, sure.
And so surgeons often talk during these operations because they're stream of consciousness, they're passing time as well as working on the patient.
Well, he didn't so much. It was just this late night in the ER, blood everywhere, him and me. And so he was talking, I think he was teaching me how to be on a trauma team, how to be a surgeon, how to focus on the patient. And so it was a unique kind of situation.
Did he ever suggest that he had seen that it was clear that it was a frontal wound, and he was always?
Yes. No, he was absolutely adamant about it, that he went right through the bullet hole that came in right under the tracheal cartilage. And the lesson is, if there's a hole there, use it.
Well, did he talk about being pressured?
He talked about being pressured later, and also because the entire medical team from Parkland, like 15 top surgeons of the world, left their homes in Parkland and took over the surgical department in Seattle. It was a major move, and all of us understood it was because of the terrible pressure that they were under at Parkland because of the testimony, Kennedy testimony, and the risks to several nurses, I think, were killed and people disappeared, and it was a time when they were all being terribly pressured, and they came to Seattle.
Because again, if they had held to their story that Kennedy was shot from the front, the government's setup of Oswald falls apart, and the lie is apparent. So they have to break these doctors at Parkland, otherwise they can't lie to the public that Kennedy was shot by Oswald.
Yes, and it must have been difficult for them because these were the world's most famous surgeons. So you can't just pop them off and throw them out of a car without a great deal of attention. Plus,
Yeah,
they were the most honorable men in the world. I mean, Malcolm Perry was absolutely the best. So it must have been torture for him to be forced to change what he knew was true.
Well, there's some more testimony. Recently, author Rob Couteau found some contemporaneous evidence. He found a journal article published by Martin Stedman, who was a reporter in Dallas at the time of the assassination. And assassination's researcher, an excellent researcher, James DiEugenio, confirmed that Stedman was indeed in Dallas for several days after the assassination, gathering information. DiEugenio also noted that some of Stedman's information got into print, but this newly discovered article was not published. Stedman's article, 50 Years from the Fatal Day in Dallas, was published on a blog, and it was picked up. And Stedman wrote, I was in Dallas as a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune there in Dallas to inquire into the unanswered questions surrounding the shocking events of November 22nd to 24th, the assassination, 1963. On the evening of December 2nd, 1963, so it's just a few weeks after the assassination, Stan Redding, crime reporter from the Houston Chronicle, and Fred Ferretti, a colleague from the New York Herald Tribune, visited Perry at his home shortly after dinner time. Stedman remembered a little girl playing with her toys on the living room floor as the three reporters and her father talked about how he tried to save the president's life. He commented that the controversy over the Perry's press conference, quote, didn't erupt until government officials in Washington said all three shots at the president had been fired from the sixth floor window of the building behind the president. Okay, and Stedman described the meeting. So Dr. Perry said he believed it was an entrance wound in the throat because a small circular hole was clean with no ragged edges. Of course, the conversation was asked and answered that he had treated hundreds of gunshot wounds in the emergency room at Parkland Memorial Hospital. Another point, he said he was a hunter by hobby, was very familiar with guns and ammunition. He said he could tell at a glance the difference between an entrance wound and an exit wound with its jagged edges. So Stedman continued. But he, Perry, told us that throughout the night of November 22nd, 1963, the night of the assassination, received a series of phone calls to his home from irate doctors at the Bethesda Naval Hospital where the autopsy was being conducted. Doctors there were becoming increasingly frustrated with his belief that it was an entrance wound. Said they asked him if the doctors in Dallas had turned the president over and examined the wounds in his back. He said they had not. They told him he could not be certain of his conclusion if he had not examined the wounds in the president's back. They said Bethesda had the president's body and Dallas did not. They told Dr. Perry he must not continue to say he cut across what he believed was an entrance wound when there was no evidence of shots fired from the front. When he said again he could only say what he believed to be true, one or more of the autopsy doctors told him from Bethesda they would take him before a medical board if he continued to insist on what they were certain was otherwise. They threatened his license to practice medicine, Dr. Perry said. Okay, so he confirmed that the pressure was there. And Stedman continued, ultimately, Dr. Perry testified as a witness before the Warren Commission. In substance, he testified that he realized he had no proof the hole in the president's neck was an entrance wound, and he conceded the Bethesda doctors who autopsied the president would know better because they had all the forensic evidence, and he had but a fleeting recollection. So Stedman's conclusion was, I can't fault Dr. Perry for his testimony before the Warren Commission. Surely occurred to him that there was no point in holding out for a belief that couldn't be proved. And just as surely, this 34-year-old surgeon with an exemplary record and a brilliant future knew his life would be forever shadowed by conspiracy theories, relied heavily on the bullet fired from the front. He testified only as he most certainly had to testify, but I'll never forget what he said to the three reporters that night in Dallas. Okay, now, Dr. Engel, we've talked about it, and you think there was additional threats to the family.
Yeah, and what Malcolm Perry told me was that what he said to Bethesda and to the Warren Commission was that doing the tracheotomy through the bullet wound had obliterated the evidence of the bullet wound. And beyond that point, there was so much destruction, you couldn't tell much of what was going on. But the only moment you could really tell was the moment that before he did the trach. So he's the one person that could say that was an entry wound.
Right. And you've seen it, Dr. Perry do tracheotomies, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, he was absolutely the best. He taught everyone in Seattle how to do them.
Now the gaping wound on Kennedy that shows up in the autopsy photographs, it's not a nice, neat slit to open up the bullet hole. This is a gaping wound. The whole throat looks like it's dug apart. I mean, did Dr. Perry's tracheotomies look like the whole throat had been disturbed and internal tissue exposed?
No.
No, it didn't. It would be simple
You'd be
slits.
just going through and getting a tube in.
And
But
so
that act meant he had to
Yes.
widen it with the
tube.
spreaders, and then
But
get
that's
the
not
tube in.
a gaping hole that stretches almost from neck to neck.
No, and the way you described the entry bullet wound, it wasn't. Bullet wounds usually aren't. So
they're small puncture holes.
puncture holes, right? And they're sterile. That's the nice thing about bullet wounds, is that they're always sterile because of the heat generated when the bullet's being shot. You don't have to worry so much about infection immediately.
Okay, now
So that's why he favored using a bullet hole when he could.
And in our discussions, you said you have reason to think that Dr. Perry's family might have been threatened more than just his career.
Yeah, something serious happened. He, as a person, would not have backed down. They weren't going to take his medical license away from him. But and this is rumors because he didn't tell me this directly, that his family was seriously threatened, which is why he agreed to go to Seattle. And the threats continued. So, but that I can't say to. I can tell you what he told me one-on-one in the emergency room when he was teaching me how to do a trach.
Right, but you have a recollection that it was said that perhaps his son had been even kidnapped or threatened to be kidnapped.
Yes, there was something like that. But since I can't find anything about it, and I if Tom Shires is still alive, he would know. Dr. Shires,
who was Dr. Shires?
He was the head of the trauma department, and he came with Malcolm Perry to Seattle.
So Perry would have talked about the threats he received to his family intimately
to Tom Shires and the other senior attendings that he came with.
And there's this vague recollection you've got that his son might have been kidnapped, or there might have been a threat to kidnap his son. I mean, they went after his family and scared him enough and his family enough that he equivocated. What he said was that the act of doing the tracheotomy could have altered the evidence. Yeah, he never really admitted that it was an exit wound.
No, he never said it was an exit wound. He said his surgery altered the appearance of it and obliterated the absolute evidence, which it did.
So he
cut open the hole.
He couldn't prove any longer he was right.
Nope.
And so he conceded that he couldn't prove he was right, but he didn't.
And they couldn't prove him wrong either.
And he didn't concede that he was wrong.
No.
He gave in to their hypothetical guessing that, this back wound could have connected. Yeah, well, angels could have come in and saved Jack Kennedy too. They just didn't.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things could happen hypothetically, but Perry was very, very circumspect in saying that since he'd obliterated the wound by doing the tracheotomy, it was no longer in the state with which he'd made his original judgment. So he couldn't go back and put it back in that state. And so he couldn't say for sure.
Right. And I can tell you that those Parkland surgeons knew more about gunshot wounds than anyone else in the world. They had treated more people, more trauma cases. They were the world's experts on what was an entrance wound, what was an exit wound, and how you treat it. They'd done the most research on it. And the huge pressure it must have taken to force an entire surgical department to leave Parkland Hospital and come to the University of Washington, which was nowhere near as nice as Parkland.
Now, Parkland was really one of the better places to be.
It was the best place to be. It had the state-of-the-art everything. At that time, Seattle was a backwater, which is why they came. But in terms of the facilities and the equipment and all that, it got better, but it was no comparison to Parkland.
They sought obscurity because they thought it gave them some cover.
Yes.
And they went as a unit, so the doctors all switched.
Unheard of. They brought their residents, they brought their nurses, they brought medical students. It was a huge undertaking. And they did it without telling anyone. They just sort of appeared one day. So all of this was done. And of course, the surgeons at the University of Washington were furious. They were not happy.
I'm sure they lost this whole team. You know,
well, Parkland lost their team, and the University of Washington got replaced by the hot shots.
Right, and you know, it had to have been a massive, frightening scare
for all of them.
Otherwise, I mean, they would have told the truth.
And they would have stayed in Parkland.
But they didn't. And so that's a clear indication of the massive pressure put upon them, and it's another clear indication of the extent to which the government went to lie, to alter the facts, the evidence, to fit the lying narrative, and to perpetuate this Truman Show we've been living under, this Jim Carrey Truman Show, that Jack Kennedy was shot from behind, 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository. Lee Harvey Oswald failed the paraffin test. It's unlikely he shot anybody that day. And yet he's the one they framed. He's the one they killed. And it was a CIA from the moment the limousine got to Parkland Hospital, the Secret Service is seen getting buckets of water and cleaning up the blood damage from the second seat, the back seat of the limousine, which is altering a crime scene. When the puncture wound was seen in the limousine, they cordoned off the limousine, would not let anybody photograph it, and they got the limousine out of there right away. By Sunday, that limousine was in Dearborn, Michigan, and they replaced the windshield, destroyed the original windshield. Government's altering evidence, including altering the body of the president and pre-autopsy surgery. This is a government conspiracy to kill the president and get away with it, which until now they've done. So I think, Dr. Engel, your testimony is extremely important and new. I think you haven't really told the story publicly. Have you told the story publicly before?
No, I haven't. We talked about it when I was an intern. What was that, 50 years ago?
Right.
But no, I never have.
Well, thank you for coming forward. It adds additional information. And we will certainly publicize this. We're going to have you back to talk about your MK Ultra experience. That'll be the second chapter. And encouraging people before that to get your book, Sparky, which is Surviving Sex Magic. And it's a compelling story of your experience in MK Ultra, which unveils another important personal experience, illuminating a very dark part of our government manipulated history.
Which is important because it's influencing what's happening now.
So does the Kennedy assassination live.
Exactly. It's all part of the same, which is largely why I agreed to even talk about Dr. Perry.
Yes, because you kept that private and respected him for 50 years since you first met him. He was a mentor.
He was wonderful. And he died, and he was a chain smoker. And he died of lung cancer in 2009.
Well, with all the tension and complexes he must have had over what he was forced to do, I'm sure it affected his life and his health.
I'm sure it did. He was under terrible pressure and a lot of guilt. But if you can talk to Dr. Tom Shires, if he's still alive, he would know quite a lot.
I'll try to track that down and find out. I don't know at the moment whether he is alive or not. But there's also, it's been on the internet, it's been shown recently. Paramount did they finally got the tapes from the doctors at Parkland and allowed them to be seen by the public. And that was just recently. And the doctors at Parkland give a lot of testimony about Kennedy being shot from the front. So they're now getting to be overwhelming evidence that the government has lied. And that this is coming out now. I think the government understand they can't maintain this lie any longer. It's an important part of deconstructing this evil intelligence operation, military industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about, that has thrown us into perpetual wars, depopulationist, this dark evil agenda, which has controlled the United States of America to destroy the United States of America and destroy our freedoms.
And the MK Ultra conditioned the generation of people, starting with my generation, that are making this happen, who are the mind-controlled arms of this.
We'll get into that as our second broadcast.
Yes, we can talk about that.
Dr. Engel, thank you for joining us. I know it takes some courage to talk about these topics, and I greatly admire your willingness to come forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Jerome Corsi, in the end, God always wins. God's going to win here too. And I implore everybody in the spirit of 2 Chronicles 7:14, let's get on our knees and ask God to forgive us for letting this dark satanic element control our country for so long. God will win. God did not create this experience to lose. Satan gets sent back to hell. And I pray that the judgment of God upon us for allowing all this evil to happen without more strongly protesting it, more strongly overturning it, that we will be forgiven. God will hear our plea and heal our land. Dr. Jerome Corsi, thank you for joining us. This is thetruthcentral.com. We're doing podcasts every weekday, and we look forward to continuing. Thank you for joining us. God bless.